The crack of warning shots split the Colorado Territory sunset as Mercy Washington pressed her pregnant belly against the rough cabin wall, watching Sam Mackenzie's trembling hands grip his father's old rifle, while Sheriff Clayton's voice boomed across the dusty yard that 3 armed riders on horseback had surrounded with the cold precision of men who believed justice belonged to whoever could afford to buy it. 6 weeks ago, Jeremiah Burns had cast Mercy out into the wilderness winter with nothing but the clothes on her back, and the bitter taste of his words that no colored woman had any claim to his dead wife's charity. But now the gentle Scottish rancher who had found her collapsed in a snowdrift stood between her and the men who wanted to drag her back to face charges of theft that existed only in the imagination of a greedy brother-in-law who would rather see her dead than see her free. The sheriff's ultimatum hung in the air like gunsmoke, giving them until dawn to surrender or face the consequences, while Magnus Caldwell sat tall in his saddle with the satisfied smirk of a man who had orchestrated this confrontation to claim both Mercy's freedom and Sam's water rights in one calculated move that would leave 2 decent people with nothing but each other to depend on in a territory where that might not be enough to survive. Behind the cabin door, Clara's hidden letters rustled in Mercy's pocket like whispered promises from beyond the grave, carrying secrets that could either save them both or destroy the fragile sanctuary they had built together in the shadow of mountains that had witnessed 1,000 such struggles between power and justice, between hatred and hope, between the law as it was written and the law as it was lived by people who had learned that sometimes the only family worth having was the one you chose to fight for when the whole world told you to let go. In that moment of reckoning, with her child stirring restlessly in her womb and Sam's quiet courage standing like a fortress between her and the devils of her past, Mercy Washington understood that she had spent her entire life preparing for this single choice between surrender and defiance, between accepting the place the world had carved out for her and claiming the place she intended to make for herself and the daughter she would raise to know that freedom was not something you begged for but something you built with your own 2 hands and defended with every breath in your body. The dawn light crept across the valley like spilled milk on worn wood. Mercy counted, her heartbeats against the cabin wall. Each thump reminded her that time moved forward whether she willed it or not. Sam lowered his rifle as the riders disappeared beyond the ridge. His hands shook worse than winter leaves. The weapon had belonged to his father, a man who never fired it at another human soul. Now it felt heavier than stone in Sam's grip. Neither spoke for long minutes. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Mercy pressed, her palm against her belly. The child inside stirred restlessly, as if sensing the tension that crackled through the morning air. She had felt this weight before, the crushing pressure of other people's decisions bearing down on her shoulders. Sam set the rifle against the doorframe. His movements carried the careful precision of a man who had learned to make every action count. The morning light caught the worry lines around his eyes. The confrontation had roots that ran deeper than yesterday's anger. 6 weeks had passed since Mercy first collapsed in the snow on his land. 6 weeks since she had arrived like a ghost from someone else's nightmare. That November day felt carved from ice and desperation. Mercy had ridden Clara's lame mare across territory that stretched endlessly in every direction. The horse stumbled, more with each mile. Its breath came in ragged clouds that dissipated like broken promises. Clara's letter had promised sanctuary, safety, a place where Mercy could raise her child without looking over her shoulder every dawn. The paper had grown, soft from handling, worn thin from desperate reading during the long journey west. But Jeremiah Burns possessed different ideas about charity and family obligations. He stood on Clara's porch like a scarecrow dressed in Sunday clothes. His eyes held the flat coldness of a man who measured human worth in dollars and bloodlines. When Mercy showed him Clara's letter, he read it once. Then he tore it into pieces that scattered across the wind like dying butterflies. Clara's homestead spread across good land with water rights and fertile soil. Jeremiah inherited it all when fever took his wife. The law favored men with proper papers and white skin. The law had never favored women like Mercy. Jeremiah gave her one day to gather her belongings and leave. He provided a horse that limped and supplies that would last maybe a week if stretched thin. His generosity ended there. The journey nearly killed her. Winter storms arrived early that year, bringing snow that fell like judgment from an angry sky. The horse died 2 days out from any settlement. Mercy walked the final miles through drifts that reached her knees. Cold seeped through her worn coat and settled in her bones. Her child kicked frantically as her body temperature dropped. She talked to the baby during those endless hours of walking, promised things she might not live to deliver. The fever came on the 3rd day. Mercy's vision blurred and her steps grew unsteady. She knew the signs, knew that people died alone in this country when their strength finally gave out. Sam found her at sunset, collapsed beside his fence line like a bundle of discarded clothes. At first he thought she might be dead. Then he saw her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He carried her to his cabin without hesitation. His father had taught him that helping others was not optional. It was simply what decent people did when confronted with suffering. The cabin held little luxury but offered warmth and shelter. Sam had built it with his own hands using timber from his land. Every board and nail represented hours of careful work. He took pride in making things that lasted. Mercy recovered slowly over the following days. Sam tended her fever with cool cloths and beef broth. He asked few questions and offered no judgment. His kindness felt foreign after Jeremiah's cruelty. When she grew strong enough to sit up, Mercy noticed the papers scattered across Sam's table. Legal documents with official seals. Her eyes moved across the text automatically. Sam watched her, read with growing surprise. Most people in their situation could not read. Education remained a privilege reserved for those with money and proper breeding. But Clara had taught Mercy letters and numbers during long winter evenings back east. Knowledge became another form of currency in a world that offered few opportunities. Sam's papers told their own story of struggle. Property taxes and water rights, boundary disputes and legal challenges. The bureaucracy that governed frontier life demanded constant attention and perfect documentation. Mercy understood documents and legal language better than Sam expected. She began helping him organize his affairs during her recovery. The partnership developed naturally from necessity and mutual benefit. But Sam carried secrets that cast shadows across his careful kindness. Letters arrived that he read alone and burned in the fireplace. His jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned. In town, the weight of unspoken troubles pressed against his shoulders like a physical burden. Mercy recognized the signs. She had lived with secrets her entire life. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, even to people who showed you nothing but grace. The townspeople noticed their arrangement and disapproved. Whispers followed Mercy when she accompanied Sam to the general store. Eyes tracked their movements with the hungry attention of people who fed on scandal and judgment. Magnus Caldwell possessed the loudest voice among the critics. He owned the largest ranch in the territory and believed that ownership extended to local opinions and social customs. His interest in Sam's water rights grew sharper when Mercy arrived. Magnus understood that isolated people made easier targets. Sam's protection of Mercy provided the perfect excuse to apply pressure and create problems that might force a profitable solution. The threatening letters began arriving soon after Mercy's recovery. Anonymous warnings about harboring undesirable elements. Suggestions that certain arrangements might lead to legal complications. The careful language of people who preferred intimidation to direct confrontation. Sam burned each letter after reading it once. But Mercy saw how his shoulders tensed when the mail arrived, how his eyes scanned the horizon more frequently, how he checked the rifle's ammunition each evening before sleep. The storm was building around them with the slow inevitability of changing weather. They could feel the pressure dropping, see the dark clouds gathering on their personal horizon. Neither spoke directly about the growing danger, but both understood that their fragile sanctuary existed at the mercy of people who showed precious little mercy to anyone who challenged their notion of proper behavior. The child in Mercy's womb grew stronger each day. Soon, she would need to make decisions about birthing and raising a baby in a world that had already declared war on their small attempt at building something decent from the wreckage of broken dreams. Winter deepened around the cabin like cupped hands holding precious warmth. Mercy's strength returned with the steady patience of water carving stone. Her belly grew rounder as the days shortened, and the child inside pressed against her ribs with increasing urgency. Sam's cattle began falling sick in December. The animals stumbled through the snow with glazed eyes and labored breathing. Their ribs showed sharp beneath dull coats. Sam watched his modest herd dwindle with the quiet desperation of a man counting his remaining chances. Mercy found him one morning standing over a fallen heifer. His shoulders sagged under the weight of accumulated losses. The wind carried the scent of approaching death across the frozen pasture. She knelt beside the sick animal despite her swollen belly. Her fingers traced the heifer's neck, feeling for swollen glands and checking the color of its gums. Clara had taught her to read the language of illness in both humans and animals. Knowledge passed down through necessity and careful observation. The diagnosis came quickly: selenium deficiency complicated by mineral imbalance. The local soil leached nutrients that cattle required for healthy growth. Sam's modest resources had prevented him from purchasing proper supplements. Mercy knew which wild plants contained the missing nutrients. She gathered rose hips and pine needles, dried lichens and bitter bark. Her hands worked with the careful precision of someone who understood that mistakes in medicine could mean the difference between life and death. The remedy took weeks to show results, but gradually the cattle began lifting their heads when she approached with her herbal mixtures. Their eyes cleared, and their appetites returned. Sam watched the transformation with wonder that bordered on reverence. Word spread through the territory about the miraculous recovery of Sam's herd. Neighbors began arriving with their own sick animals. Mercy treated each case with the same methodical care she had shown Sam's cattle. She accepted no payment but gained something more valuable than money. Respect grew slowly in a place where respect was earned through competence and results. The local ranchers might disapprove of her presence in Sam's cabin, but they could not argue with her ability to save their livestock. Magnus Caldwell arrived on a February morning when ice still glazed the water troughs. He rode a black stallion that pranced and snorted in the cold air. His clothes spoke of wealth and authority. His eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who viewed other people as obstacles or opportunities. Sam emerged from the barn as Magnus dismounted. The two men faced each other across the yard with the careful politeness of neighbors who shared boundaries but not friendship. The conversation remained civil on the surface while deeper currents of tension flowed beneath every word. Magnus expressed concern about Sam's living arrangements. He suggested that certain situations might create legal complications for a man trying to establish himself in respectable society. His words carried the weight of veiled threats wrapped in false concern. Sam listened without responding. His hands remained steady as he continued repairing a broken harness. The leather strips wove together under his fingers with practiced efficiency. He had learned long ago that silence often proved more powerful than argument. Magnus shifted tactics when direct intimidation failed to produce results. He mentioned the water rights that made Sam's land valuable, how certain legal challenges might arise if Sam's property ownership faced scrutiny, how men without proper documentation sometimes lost everything they thought they owned. The threat hung in the cold air like visible breath. Sam's hand stilled on the leather strips. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Magnus smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had found his target's weakness. Mercy watched the exchange from the cabin window. She understood the language of power and intimidation, had lived with its weight pressing against her shoulders since childhood. The patterns remained consistent, whether the setting was a plantation in Georgia or a ranch in Colorado territory. That evening, Sam sat longer than usual, staring into the fireplace. The flames danced across his face in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Mercy sorted through her collection of medicinal herbs while stealing glances at his troubled expression. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Both carried secrets that felt too dangerous to speak aloud. Both understood that their fragile partnership existed at the mercy of forces larger than their individual will to resist. 3 days later, the first threatening letter arrived. Sam read it once before feeding it to the flames. But Mercy caught the tension that suddenly gripped his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the horizon more frequently, the careful attention he paid to securing the cabin door each night. More letters followed with increasing frequency. Anonymous. warnings about harboring undesirable elements, suggestions that certain arrangements violated community standards, the careful language of people who preferred intimidation to direct confrontation. Sam burned each letter without comment, but the weight of accumulating pressure showed in the lines around his eyes, in the way he checked his rifle each evening, in the restless energy that kept him awake long after midnight. Mercy began helping with the ranch paperwork during her final weeks of pregnancy. Her literacy proved invaluable in organizing the complex documentation that governed frontier property ownership. She discovered gaps in Sam's records that could create legal vulnerabilities. The work brought them closer together in ways that transcended their original arrangement. They moved through the daily routines of ranch life with the synchronized efficiency of people who had learned to anticipate each other's needs and reactions. But intimacy bred its own complications. Mercy caught herself watching Sam's hands as he worked, the gentle way he treated injured animals, the quiet strength that never demanded recognition or praise. Feelings grew that she could not afford to acknowledge. Sam struggled with his own forbidden thoughts. The sound of Mercy's voice as she read legal documents aloud, the graceful way she moved despite her advancing pregnancy, the intelligence that sparked behind her eyes when she solved problems that had confounded him for months. Both understood that their situation allowed no room for romantic complications. The world outside their cabin had already declared war on their attempt to build something decent from the wreckage of broken dreams. Adding forbidden desire to the mix would only provide additional ammunition for their enemies. The baby began dropping lower in March as Mercy's due date approached. She felt the child's head pressing against her pelvis with increasing urgency. Soon she would need to make decisions about birthing in a place where medical help remained scarce and judgmental. Sam began making discreet inquiries about midwives willing to attend a birth under complicated circumstances. The responses revealed the depth of community disapproval. Several women refused outright. Others demanded payment he could not afford. The isolation pressed against them like gathering storm clouds. They had built their sanctuary through mutual necessity and growing respect. But the walls they had constructed to protect their fragile partnership might not prove strong enough to withstand the forces gathering beyond their carefully tended boundaries. Magnus Caldwell's visits became more frequent as winter gave way to spring. Each conversation carried sharper edges of threat disguised as neighborly concern. He spoke of property values and community standards, of legal complications that might arise for men who flouted social conventions. The pressure built with the slow inevitability of changing weather. Sam and Mercy could feel the storm approaching in the shifting attitudes of townspeople, in the whispered conversations that stopped when they entered the general store, in the way certain neighbors no longer acknowledged their presence on the street. Something would have to give soon. The delicate balance they had maintained through winter could not survive the harsh scrutiny of people determined to restore their notion of proper order to a world that had grown too complicated for simple answers. Spring arrived with the sound of melting snow and the scent of mud turned earth. Mercy's labor pains began on a Tuesday morning when frost still glazed the cabin windows. The contractions started gentle as breathing, then built like approaching thunder across distant mountains. Sam rode hard to fetch the one midwife willing to attend the birth. Mrs. Henley lived 15 miles south and charged double her usual fee for what she called complicated circumstances. Her weathered hands delivered Mercy's daughter as the sun reached its peak overhead. The baby arrived with fierce lungs and grasping fingers. She weighed barely 6 pounds but possessed the determined spirit of someone who had fought for every breath. Mercy held her daughter close and whispered promises about the world they would build together. Sheriff Clayton arrived 3 days later, while Mercy still ached from childbirth. He rode with official papers and the careful politeness of a man performing distasteful duties. Jeremiah Burns followed 20 paces behind on his bay gelding, his face set in lines of righteous satisfaction. The sheriff read the warrant slowly while Sam stood in the cabin doorway. Theft of personal property, fraud involving legal documents. The charges carried enough weight to demand investigation, if not conviction. Jeremiah had constructed his accusations with the careful precision of a man who understood how legal systems favored certain stories over others. Mercy emerged from the cabin with her daughter wrapped in Clara's old quilt. The baby slept peacefully against her mother's chest, unaware that her first week of life had become the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything fragile they had built. The confrontation played out in the yard where Sam had first found Mercy collapsed in the snow. Now she stood upright with dignity carved from suffering and determination. Her dark eyes met Jeremiah's gaze without flinching. She had endured worse men than him and survived with her spirit intact. Jeremiah presented his evidence with theatrical flourishes. Witnesses who claimed they had seen Mercy steal money from Clara's strongbox. Documentation proving his sole ownership of Clara's estate. The careful fabrication of a man who had learned that lies became truth when spoken with sufficient authority. Sheriff Clayton examined the papers with professional skepticism. His weathered face revealed nothing as he compared documents and checked signatures. The law demanded evidence, but often settled for convenience when evidence proved scarce. Mercy reached into her coat pocket and withdrew Clara's letters. The papers had yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear. Clara's handwriting flowed across the pages in the careful script of an educated woman recording her final wishes. The letters told a different story than Jeremiah's version of events. Clara had planned for Mercy's arrival, had set aside money, and made legal arrangements for her stepsister's protection. The documentation bore official seals and witness signatures that predated Clara's final illness. Jeremiah's face darkened as Sheriff Clayton read Clara's actual will. His carefully constructed narrative began crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence, but desperation made him dangerous rather than defeated. He claimed the letters were forgeries, insisted that Mercy lacked the education necessary to create such sophisticated documents. His voice rose with the shrill desperation of a man watching, his schemes collapse into dust and bitter consequences. Sheriff Clayton compared handwriting samples with methodical care. Clara's letters matched other documents in his possession. The paper bore watermarks that would be difficult to forge. The legal language followed proper forms that few people outside the profession could duplicate. Magnus Caldwell arrived as the investigation reached its crucial moment. He rode with two hired men whose presence added weight to whatever pressure he intended to apply. His timing suggested careful coordination with Jeremiah's accusations. Magnus addressed Sheriff Clayton with the casual authority of a man accustomed to having his opinions carry legal weight. He spoke of community standards and property values, of the dangers that arose when proper boundaries were ignored or challenged. The pressure built like steam in a sealed kettle. Sam stood between Mercy and the men who wanted to drag her away. His hands remained steady despite the trembling that started in his chest and spread outward through his arms. Sheriff Clayton folded the letters and returned them to Mercy with careful ceremony. His decision would determine whether justice followed evidence or convenience, whether truth mattered more than the comfortable lies that kept certain people in positions of unearned authority. The moment stretched like wire under tension. Mercy's daughter stirred against her chest and opened dark eyes that seemed to see everything. The baby's tiny fist closed around her mother's finger with surprising strength. Sam made his choice in that instant of suspended time. His voice carried across the yard with quiet conviction that brooked no argument or negotiation. Some things mattered more than personal safety. Some stands had to be taken regardless of consequences. The words that followed would determine everything that came after. Whether their small sanctuary could survive the storm of other people's hatred and greed. Whether love and decency possessed enough strength to overcome the organized forces of prejudice and manipulation. But first, Sam needed to reveal his own secret, the truth he had carried alone through months of growing pressure and accumulating threats. The vulnerability that Magnus had discovered and intended to exploit. His father's papers lay scattered across the cabin table, legal documents that told the story of a Scottish immigrant's struggle to build something lasting in unforgiving country, property deeds and water rights, immigration records and citizenship papers. The missing document was an adoption certificate that had never been properly filed. Sam possessed no legal claim to his father's name or property. He existed in the eyes of the law as an orphaned foundling with no legitimate inheritance or protection. Magnus had discovered this weakness through careful investigation and planned to exploit it for maximum advantage. A man without proper documentation made an easy target for legal challenges and property disputes, especially when that man chose to harbor people the community wanted removed. The revelation changed the stakes of their confrontation. Sam's protection of Mercy could cost him everything he thought he owned: his father's ranch and water rights, his place in a community that had barely accepted him as a legitimate member. Sheriff Clayton absorbed this information with professional interest. The legal complications multiplied like cracks in winter ice, two vulnerable people defending each other against forces that wanted to destroy them both. But Mercy had been examining Clara's papers with growing excitement. Her literacy allowed her to spot details that others might miss. Legal language that revealed connections and relationships hidden beneath the surface of obvious meanings. Clara's marriage certificate lay buried beneath property deeds and financial records. The document bore official seals and witness signatures that established her legal union to Duncan Mackenzie. Sam's father had married Clara in a quiet ceremony intended to protect both their interests. The marriage made Clara Sam's legal stepmother. More importantly, it established Sam's legitimate claim to his father's property through Clara's inheritance rights. The adoption certificate became irrelevant when family ties were established through marriage rather than formal proceedings. Jeremiah's face went pale as the implications became clear. He had been trying to claim property that belonged to Sam through his father's marriage to Clara. His theft accusations collapsed under the weight of his own attempted fraud. The truth emerged like sunrise after the longest night. Clara had protected both Mercy and Sam through careful legal planning. She had understood that they would need each other and made arrangements to ensure their partnership could survive the challenges that would inevitably arise. Magnus recognized defeat when the evidence destroyed his carefully laid plans. He withdrew with his hired men, leaving Jeremiah to face the consequences of his fraudulent accusations alone. Justice moved slowly in frontier territory but arrived, with devastating finality when it came. Sheriff Clayton prepared new warrants based on the actual evidence rather than fabricated charges. Jeremiah would face investigation for attempted theft and document fraud. The tables had turned with the swift efficiency of truth cutting through layers of deception. Mercy's daughter opened her eyes and gazed up at the faces surrounding her with the calm attention of someone born into a world where justice occasionally prevailed over convenience and hatred. The truth settled over the ranch like dust after a windstorm. Sheriff Clayton folded the marriage certificate with careful hands and returned it to Mercy's keeping. The document had transformed their legal standing in ways that reached far beyond property ownership and inheritance rights. Jeremiah mounted his horse with the defeated posture of a man whose schemes had crumbled into consequences he could not escape. His theft accusations would follow him back to town where Sheriff Clayton would file proper charges based on actual evidence rather than fabricated claims. Magnus Caldwell departed with his hired men trailing behind like shadows abandoning their source of darkness. His water rights scheme had collapsed when Sam's legal ownership became unassailable. The community would learn that intimidation worked only when its targets lacked proper documentation and family connections. The revelation that Clara had married Duncan Mackenzie created complications that neither Sam nor Mercy had anticipated. Step-siblings by marriage faced different social expectations than two strangers who had found refuge in each other's company during desperate circumstances. Mercy studied Sam's face as they processed the implications of their newly discovered relationship. The feelings that had grown between them during months of shared struggle now carried the weight of family obligation rather than romantic possibility. Sam understood without words being spoken. The marriage certificate had saved his ranch and established Mercy's legal rights. But it had also redefined their partnership in ways that closed certain doors while opening others. They moved through the days following Sheriff Clayton's investigation with the careful politeness of people learning new boundaries. The easy intimacy of their previous arrangement gave way to something more formal, yet equally deep. Mercy's daughter thrived in the mountain air and growing warmth of late spring. The baby's presence brought purpose to routines that might otherwise have felt awkward or strained. Feeding schedules and diaper changes created natural rhythms that carried them through the adjustment period. Sam built a cradle from pine wood, seasoned in his father's barn. His hands shaped each piece with the patient attention of a man who understood that some gifts could not be purchased or borrowed. They had to be made with care and offered with love. The townspeople's attitudes shifted gradually as news of the legal resolution spread through the territory. Mercy's medical knowledge remained valuable regardless of social complications. Ranchers continued bringing sick animals to the woman who could save their livestock when conventional remedies failed. Respect grew slowly, but surely. Mrs. Patterson from the general store began nodding when Mercy entered with her weekly shopping list. The blacksmith asked about remedies for his arthritic hands, small gestures that acknowledged competence and contributions to community welfare. Sam's standing improved as well. Property ownership carried weight in frontier society. Men with legal claims to good land and water rights commanded respect from neighbors who might otherwise question their belonging. Summer brought prosperity to the ranch as their combined efforts produced results that neither could have achieved alone. Sam's cattle grew fat on improved grazing supplemented by Mercy's herbal treatments. Their modest herd doubled in size as healthy animals reproduced successfully. Mercy established a small school in the cabin's main room during afternoon hours when ranch work allowed. Local children arrived with slates and primers to learn reading and arithmetic from the woman whose education surpassed that of most adults in the territory. The school brought additional income and community integration. Parents who might have disapproved of Mercy's presence found themselves grateful for educational opportunities their children could not receive elsewhere. Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reflected the transformation of their circumstances. What had begun as desperate survival had evolved into sustainable prosperity, built on mutual respect and complementary skills. Mercy's daughter celebrated her first birthday with a cake baked from flour, purchased with money earned through legitimate business endeavors. The child walked unsteadily between Sam and her mother, babbling words that sounded almost like sentences. The baby called Sam by a version of his name that delighted him beyond measure. She reached for him when she needed comfort and fell asleep in his arms when evening stories grew long. Their bond transcended blood relationships and legal definitions. Winter returned with familiar cold, but different circumstances. The cabin held warmth earned through hard work and careful planning. Food stores reflected successful harvests and profitable livestock sales. They faced the season from positions of strength rather than desperate vulnerability. Magnus Caldwell sold his ranch in November and departed for California territories where his reputation remained untarnished by failed schemes and public embarrassment. His departure removed the last organized threat to their peaceful existence. Jeremiah Burns faced trial for fraud and attempted theft. The evidence against him proved overwhelming when other victims came forward with similar complaints. Justice moved slowly, but arrived with appropriate consequences for a man who had built his prosperity on other people's misfortune. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities as their reputation for fairness and competence spread beyond the immediate territory. Travelers stopped to purchase Mercy's herbal remedies and seek Sam's advice about livestock management. The ranch expanded with the addition of new buildings and improved facilities. Sam constructed a proper schoolhouse with Mercy's input on educational requirements. The structure would serve local children and establish their commitment to permanence in the community. Mercy's medical practice grew as word spread about successful treatments and reasonable fees. She traveled to neighboring settlements when serious cases required her attention. Her expertise saved lives and earned recognition that transcended racial prejudices. Sam served on local committees that addressed water rights and territorial governance. His voice carried weight in discussions about community development and conflict resolution. Leadership emerged naturally from demonstrated competence and ethical consistency. Their partnership had evolved into something unique in a society that struggled to accommodate relationships outside traditional categories. They were family by marriage, business partners by necessity, and friends by choice. The child they raised together grew into a bright and curious girl who spoke multiple languages and read voraciously. She would inherit advantages that her mother never possessed and opportunities that previous generations could not have imagined. Years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons and successful harvests. The ranch became a landmark in the territory, known for innovative practices and inclusive policies. Their success inspired others to reconsider assumptions about cooperation across racial and cultural boundaries. The sunset painted the mountains in familiar colors as Mercy watched her daughter chase fireflies across the meadow where she had once collapsed in desperate exhaustion. Sam emerged from the barn with the satisfied expression of a man whose day's work had accomplished its intended purpose. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the child they had raised discover wonder in simple pleasures. The distance they had traveled from that first desperate winter seemed measured in more than years or miles. Their sanctuary had become a foundation for dreams they had not dared imagine when survival consumed all their energy and hope. The future stretched ahead with possibilities as vast as the territory that had tested their resolve and rewarded their persistence. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.